Welcome, fellow dissidents, to the State of Dissidents podcast. I am your radical libertarian commentator, BC, and quite a bit has changed since my last podcast. Now, in my last episode, I was extremely conservative in what I was saying and how I was saying it, and this was due to the narrative and the guidelines and the terms of service and what was acceptable at that point in time. And after having taken off 5 or 6 weeks, brushing up on philosophy and allowing the narrative to shift before I speak again, quite a bit has changed. Not only with me, but with the corporate narrative itself. When I spoke the last time on just the entire COVID narrative itself, it was as if what I was saying was just not allowed to be spoken about. And I even denounced my own thoughts on the lab leak hypothesis and just completely strayed away from the efficacy of masks and vaccines and such, because if I want any chance to gain traction with my podcast, I have to stay in bounds with our big tech oligarchs. And the narrative has shifted dramatically. It was almost immediately after the release of my last podcast episode that the narrative changed dramatically, and we all knew it was coming. Anybody who's paying attention to the corporate narrative knew that it was only a matter of time after electing Trump out of office and Biden in that the narrative would switch. And it did, but it was at a breakneck speed. It was, even for me who pays close attention to politics and the narrative itself, it was drastic how quickly and rapidly it changed. And even I myself was taken back by this. Now, that's probably my naivety about the entire situation. And, I have a normalcy bias where, as the narrative is set, it feels like it's set in stone because you cannot stray from these boundaries. And I made the mistake of trying to confine myself in them. Well, that's no more. I'm not. If I have something to say, I'm going to say it. And if I have to switch off of YouTube to Rumble or something to that effect, or if I have to pay to get a service on Locals, Dave Rubin's, it's a decentralized social network essentially. If I have to pay for something like that to continue doing this, I will do that. Because it's not that as if there is a conspiracy that has been thwarted and brought out about the entire narrative of the pandemic, but it did shift drastically. Now, if I would have stated anything about the lab leak hypothesis and the theory behind it, I probably would have gotten yanked down. Steven Crowder's first strike on his channel was quite literally because he stated CDC guidelines. So, there's only so much self-censorship that is appropriate when it gets to the point where my message is being directed by the rules of big tech oligarchs. Then I either need to quit what I'm doing or I need to just go full bore ahead. So quite literally, that's what I'm doing. Now, I don't change my stance that you should talk to your own doctor. That is, the fact that even needs to be stated just shows you where we're at in society today. That is ridiculous that anybody would look at the TV or social media or any other source for our health. The fact that our marching orders are coming down from the state and people are just blindly adhering to it should quite literally show you where we stand. Okay, so since my last podcast, not only has the narrative changed, but there have been studies one study in particular that I'd like to talk about, and it's on the efficacy of ivermectin. And if you're not familiar with Brett Weinstein, He's a evolutionary biologist, and he's very well nuanced when it comes to science and the application of science. And he had another PhD doctorate come on to his channel, which is the Dark Horse podcast, and it's typically it's him and his wife, but this one was him and another PhD scientist, and they talked about the efficacy and application of ivermectin. Now, even just mentioning ivermectin as of the date of my last podcast would have got me booted right off of YouTube, right? But now there has been a study that came out. It wasn't peer reviewed, but it is promising, and it the dialogue, let alone the application of ivermectin and the surrounding dialogue, needs to continue. And this is what Brett Weinstein is pushing for. And you can, they did yank his podcast down. They gave him a strike because, he was advocating on his channel about how he's been taking ivermectin, excuse me, and, the ramifications and pros and cons, and how he has been taking it. Now, speak to your doctor. There's no other way around it. I'm not a doctor. I'm just here to relay the message that the vaccines are not the only order of measure for this virus. There are other ways to treat this, and that's not debatable. The fact of whether the efficacy is better with one or the other is irrelevant at this point. The fact that the dialogue surrounding these conversations is being censored is my issue. I take a large issue. I don't care what the platform is or who owns the platforms. If they claim to be free speech advocates, why are these topics being censored? I mean, there's only one logical conclusion. They have a narrative, and if they stray outside of that narrative, then it seeks to take away power. The entire Biden administration, while in a fascist cooperation with big tech oligarchs, is quite literally a power grab. The entire thing. Okay, so you have this Oxford study that was advocated or talked about with known scientists. These aren't just regular guys who don't know jargon and all this stuff. No, this is people who quite literally know. This is their arena. This is what they do. And just the conversation surrounding it has been stricken from YouTube. So what I would like to do, rather than speak on it, is I would just like to point you in the proper direction. Look up Brett Weinstein and follow him and figure out what he's saying and judge for yourself. Think critically, research things. It's not something that I want to say yes or no, you should do it or you shouldn't do it, but you should certainly be looking at this stuff. To think that we have no idea what these vaccines do in a long-term process, and then on top of that we're not allowed to speak of anything else, is absolutely absurd to me. So look into Brett Weinstein, look into the Oxford study on ivermectin, and as well as Lex Friedman. He's more into IT and building robots and such, but he hosts a prominent podcast. So if you go to Lex Friedman on YouTube, there is an episode with Brett Weinstein, and they speak on ivermectin and the censorship a little more closely. So I would, rather than trying to portray myself as someone who is thoroughly knowledgeable in science and the efficacy of vaccines or ivermectin, etc., I would rather just point you to where I'm getting my knowledge from, or at least a portion of it, so you can think for yourself. I mean, the only thing about the narrative that hasn't changed is the fact that everybody needs to get a vaccine. It's undoubted, according to the Biden administration, that they have to get vaccinated. Everybody has to get vaccinated, and I disagree. There's never any talk about people who have the antibodies in their body because they already had COVID. if that's the case, then you quite literally, there's studies on it, you can look it up yourself. There's studies on it that if you've had COVID, you have the antibodies, and the vaccine is quite literally not necessary. And proof of that is in the fact that you can't even get the vaccine if you've had COVID within a certain amount of time, because it will hurt you, because you already have the antibodies. So rather than trying to portray myself as an all knowledgeable being and telling people what to do, and I'm just citing my sources. I'm just telling you that it's not, don't just run out and get vaccinated. Talk to your doctor, look into things. And that's another thing as well. I've heard a lot of people saying that they don't trust their doctors. Well, for one, you can always get a second opinion. If you don't like what your doctor is saying, then you can always get a second opinion. And make sure that the advice that you are getting is medical advice. If you go to your, okay, let's have an example. Let's say you go to your doctor and you ask him, to look into your history, and is one of these vaccinations right for you? If the answer is something in the likes of, we just need to get back to normal, so let's do this thing, that is a political, that's political advice. That has nothing to do with your personal history or the efficacy of it in your body. So make sure that you have an understanding of what these vaccines are, what they're capable of, and bring that to your doctor should you have any concerns. Now, if you have no concerns, by all means, go get the vaccine. I don't think anybody at this point actually cares. The narrative has been and will continue to be that everybody's up in arms about it, and there's a big issue. There's no issue. Talk to your doctor and continue on. The only people that have any kind of issue with other people being vaccinated or not vaccinated are ideologues. There's the only people that have any kind of issue with masks or vaccinations are the people who quite literally want to force their way of living on somebody else. If not, then why would they not be feeling this way about flu shots or any other kind of medicine or medical avenues? It's because at this point, has been a serious pandemic, and there has been a narrative from top to bottom of a message that this is the only way. And as the narrative slowly unshifts about where it came from, the efficacy of masks and vaccinations, as it all starts to unfold, people are starting to realize this. Now, this means quite literally that there really is no upheaval. Now, you do have a loud minority that it's a small percentage of people who are just radically vocal about what they feel. And this is pushing not only policy, but the social structure of the way people view this narrative. Okay? So, we're going to do a hard segue. Speaking on narratives, there has been this narrative as of lately about critical race theory. Okay? So, I have spoken on critical race theory a few times on my podcast, but there is a problem with not only just indoctrination in the public schools and academia at large, but also the fact that we are using leftist terminology to describe what they're teaching. When we say critical race theory, that automatically puts us on the battlefield of the left. It gives them the home field advantage when we're discussing this topic. Okay, so it's not just critical race theory. It's also critical gender theory and others. But it's critical theory at large. Okay, but up until this point, we have been using their terminology, which puts us on their battlefield. Okay, and most people, even moderate Democrats at this point, are learning about this, and it's only because we're starting to see through the digital networking with the teachers, because we've stayed at home and have been doing school online, that now we're seeing what these teachers are actually teaching our children. Okay, so there has been a larger movement in this country to stand against the critical race theory. Now, I haven't myself found I mean, it's just racism. We need to stop calling it critical race theory because it is critical theory that was birthed from social Marxism, and it's literally just racism. And when we use the terminology of the left, it cedes them linguistic territory, and we're already at a losing disadvantage. So we need to, for one, I don't know what we need to call it other than racism. When you define superiority or inferiority based on race, gender, or ethnicity, it is racism. It is discrimination. I don't care if you're black to white, white to black, Asian to Mexican. It does not matter. It is all inherently racist. So that's step one: is to quit using the language of the left. It gives them a headway. Okay, so we have seen a larger movement in our country of parents who do not want this taught to their children. And the radical left has stood up and said, "Oh, well, we're not teaching your children critical race theory." And this is a semantic argument. Technically, they're correct. They're not actually handing children books of Ibram X. Kennedy or Kendi, books. They're not handing them these books from him or others that are critical race theorists, avowed critical race theorists, and saying, learn this theory. That's not what's happening. So technically, semantically, they're not teaching the theory, but it's the theory in praxis. It is literally praxeology. They're putting the application into the work. So this is a crude example. Something like David has been pulled over by the police 3 times in a month, whereas Jerome has been pulled over 23 times in a month. So et cetera, et cetera. So technically, it's not the theory, but it is the application of the theory. So the critical race theory is slowly and insidiously being applied through the work to indoctrinate children. As a father, I find this so absolutely abhorrent. Like there is no part of this that is okay. When you judge somebody based on race or gender, it is discrimination. So we need to make sure that the narrative is not the narrative cannot stay about whether or not it's critical race theory or it's not. It needs to be called out for what it is. It is blatant and inherent racism. Now, this is a white pill to me. White pill is optimism, black pill is pessimism, for those who may not know. But this is a white pill for me. The fact that I have seen moderate Democrats, your traditional liberals, standing up against all of this nonsense, it's beautiful. Because they are the ones who have typically just aligned with conformity. And the conformity as of the past 4 or 5 years has been whatever the radical left says. Because if not, then you're not tolerant. We cannot tolerate intolerance. It's quite literally been the status quo of the last 5 years or so. And it's just funny how in my view, at a breakneck pace, the narrative switches, whether it's COVID or whether it's CRT. And I don't even like calling it CRT because that, like I said, that's linguistic territory that is ceded to the left. It's actually kind of funny. I watch Tim Pool quite regularly because he gives you, I watch all kinds of stuff from all over the spectrum, but Tim Pool is, I try to use him as a point of reference because he's obviously not we agree on a lot, but he's obviously not a radical libertarian. He is a traditional liberal. He's a moderate, whatever, moderate centrist, whatever you want to call him. But on his show, they've been calling it critical race applied praxis. CRAP. It's crap. Critical race applied praxis. So, crap. That's pretty funny to me. I say we go with that if we're going to use anything, because it's not just CRT. It's also critical gender theory, which is why there has been a large movement in our young adult females in our country to want to be transgender or to transfer, whatever the case is, Zers and all these pronouns, and this whole conversation was birthed from critical theory. It's not just critical race theory. Now we're seeing the critical race theory because the corporate narrative has just been inundated to everybody. If you have seen any amount of corporate narrative in the last few years, you know that they're trying to bait a race war in our country, and unfortunately the ground has been set, the groundwork has been done. They are pitting sides against each other when it comes to race, but it's not just that. So remember, it's not just critical race theory. It's critical race applied practice. So it's crap, right? So also there's a guy named Michael Malice. I could not recommend this man enough. He is extremely intelligent, very very strategic in how he does his things. If you have a Twitter, follow him on Twitter, Michael Malice. He's an anarchist. That's his political leanings. Basically, he's a radical libertarian, but he doesn't define it that way. But his evolution was through libertarianism, and now he is as of the position to abolish the state completely. But don't let that negate the fact that this man has large amounts of political knowledge, and he is brilliant. And one of the things that he has said as of lately is that a lot of people call it, including myself up until now, we have called the corporate news mainstream media. Now, his argument is that there is nothing mainstream about it. Their narrative is quite literally very, very radical, and it's not the typical view of your regular American person. So another linguistic territory that we need to stop ceding to the left is calling it the mainstream media. Call it for what it is. It is the corporate news. It's the corporate media. It's the corporate narrative. This will help bring division between us and them being the corporate media, because there is nothing mainstream about them. And when we cede that linguistic territory, it gives them a faux elegance, like as if they hold some kind of salt with the regular people, when most people would not say that radical gender studies is the mainstream. I think at least my listeners would agree that that's not mainstream. Also, one thing about the corporate narrative that I would like to touch on is Tucker Carlson has come out and talked about the NSA spying on his emails. Now, the NSA came out with a denial, but they didn't actually deny that they were spying on him. They just denied that that they were looking at him specifically. Now, when the NSA is looking at an American citizen, it has to be by proxy through a foreign adversary. So it could have very well been that Tucker Carlson, because he was, as he stated, he was trying to get an interview with Putin. He wanted to, have dialogue and probably discuss a lot of things, probably along the nature of Putin saying he wants Biden in office. I think anybody with a sane brain knows why Putin wants Biden in office. It's because Biden is a puppet, So, but anyways, that's an aside. Because of this, that may have led to, because a source came through for Tucker Carlson and told him that the NSA was looking at him and had information on him. And, I don't know if it's true or not what Tucker Carlson is saying, but you'd have to have been living under a rock since the early 2000s to not know that our privacy has been radically diminished over the last 20 some years. I mean, the Patriot Act quite literally gives our federal government the right to look into our all of our digital stuff and all kinds of stuff because of the Patriot Act. So, I mean, I'm not saying Tucker Carlson isn't setting his own narrative, But the fact that the NSA didn't come out and outright just say, no, we're not looking directly at him for this, or that, and they just denied it very broadly. So now we have the one mainstream, excuse me, the one corporate news conglomerate of Fox News. They have one person left that is worth a damn when listening to, and that's Tucker Carlson. And not only is Brian Stelter and all of CNN and MSNBC trying to label him as, he's the new Trump, as in he's the new, aim to go after because he's a radical and all this. And now they're trying to paint him as Alex Jones. Brian Stelter put up a clip of two sentences, literally two from Tucker and two from Alex Jones, and they sounded similar. So now they just paint with a broad stroke and say, yep, he's the new Alex Jones, because they want they want to discredit him. They want Tucker Carlson and his narrative to just outright be gone. Just like people like me. They do not like that there has been dissent. If they have a narrative, it has to be their narrative. It has to be the corporate narrative. Any amount of dissent is not okay. And the reason why I talk about Tucker Carlson is because if they can do it to a large, prominent figure such as him, what do you think they can do to regular folks? People like me who are sticking their neck out, who buy a camera and a microphone and say, I don't agree with the narrative. I want to stand against the narrative. I want to rally people up to dissent against the state. Right? What happens to folks like me if they can do it to someone as prominent as Tucker Carlson? Now, I don't have any kind of following at this point that would throw up any kind of flag, but even just gaining traction, the name of this podcast was a flagrant foul to the establishment. It was intentional. Liberty is the antithesis to government and the state. Okay, so my radical libertarianism, it flies in the face of the establishment. So what did I do? I made a podcast and I started speaking my feelings genuinely, as true as my worldview will admit. Okay, and I named it The State of Dissidents for a reason. One, it's a play on words because a dissident is literally dissent of the state. So it's a play on words, right? State of dissidents. But it is encouraging people to look at the corporate narrative. I have been in a toss-up between, doing a live reading of actual news or just a more informal conversation, such as what I'm doing now. But it'll probably end up being a mix between the two. But I just want to have the conversation. If I have to, based on my my dialogue, I have to switch to another platform, I will. Every time I take a few weeks off, it's not just because I don't want to do this. I most certainly do like to do this. I enjoy having political dialogue with folks that are like-minded and not like-minded. I don't mind having a disagreement because that's the only way you can further any kind of philosophy or any kind of critical thinking. That was the entire premise behind why I wanted to do this. So if that dialogue forces me out to other avenues, then I'll do that. I would love to gain traction and have a prominent following of people who think critically, and whether we agree or disagree on all of the politics, stated above, but they listen and they're willing to advocate for more liberty. There's only two things that I think that are mandatory when talking politics. Ending the military industrial complex free reign, endless wars, and the economic situation in our country, the Federal Reserve and the abolition of that. Those are the only two things that I believe are mandatory. But there is no reason why, if we disagree even on both of those things, we can't find and seed common ground to each other to get to gain traction with each other, rather than always finding a reason to divide ourselves. We need to learn to find commonalities, and that is quite literally what I'm trying to do. So, our dissent of the day was corporate narrative switching at a breakneck speed on the lab leak and vaccines, and they're still pushing the vaccines because this is their last shot. This is their last push. They have to get shots in arms immediately. Okay? And the second dissent was the talk about ivermectin. I would have been stricken from social media for even speaking about it as of my last episode, but here we are speaking about it. So that was dissent number 2. Find Brett Weinstein on all social medias and YouTube, as well as at a minimum look at his podcast on Lex Friedman. Okay, and dissent number 3 was the CRT narrative and our federal government poking their head out of the bushes at people as prominent as Tucker Carlson. Okay, so watch the narrative. If it shifts, sit back and watch. Learn about it and dig into it. Don't just wait for your favorite commentator or politician to tell you about it. Look into it. Question things. That's my biggest thing. This is why I don't always bring up articles and such, because I would rather say something that you have to go look for yourself. Okay? So if anything that I have stated in this episode has thrown a flag and made you think, by all means, please share. That is the most important thing you could do to not only show me your support, but to help in the algorithm and help me gain traction. To build an audience is my main objective. I'm not looking to gain fame or fortune. I just want to spread ideas about liberty and call out the corporate narrative for what it is, because there are plenty of podcasts today. There's no shortage, but there's not enough advocating for more liberty. So by all means, like, share, subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.